Hello and welcome to podcast.init, the podcast about Python and the people who make it great. When you're ready to launch your next app or want to try a project you hear about on the show, you'll need somewhere to deploy it, so take a look at our friends over at Linode. With 200 gigabit private networking, scalable shared block storage, node balancers, and a 40 gigabit public network, all controlled by a brand new API, you've got everything you need to scale up. And for your tasks that need fast computation, such as training machine learning models, they just launched dedicated CPU instances. And they also have a new object storage service to make storing data for your apps even easier. Go to pythonpodcast.com/linode, that's Linode today to get a $20 credit and launch a new server in under a minute. And don't forget to thank them for their continued support of this show. And you listen to this show to learn and stay up to date with the ways that Python is being used, including the latest in machine learning and data analysis. For even more opportunities to meet, listen, and learn from your peers, you don't want to miss out on this year's conference season. We have partnered with organizations such as O'Reilly Media, Corinium Global Intelligence, Aluxio, and Data Council. Go to pythonpodcast.com/conferences to learn more about these and other events, and take advantage of our partner discounts to save money when you register today. Your host, as usual, is Tobias Macey, and today I'm interviewing Pete Hodgson about the concept of feature flags and how they can benefit your development workflow. So, Pete, can you start by introducing yourself?
Sure. My name is Pete Hodgson, and I'm an independent software consultant. I spend quite a lot of time helping engineering teams figure out kind of how to build software in a more effective way and get that software into production in a more effective way.
And I know that you don't use Python for your primary language and that you don't generally do too much work in it, but I'm wondering if you can just share a bit about sort of maybe how it first came onto your radar and any experience that you do have with it.
Sure. First came onto my radar. Well, I guess I've been doing software development for 20 years, and I think probably around the same time that I was early in my career, I was trying to figure out how to kind of script things and automate things. And I think Python and Ruby were the two that I started playing with. No, actually Perl first, and then rapidly realized that I'd rather use something other than Perl. And so I played with Python and Ruby, and then I actually eventually got into Ruby because I happened to be working somewhere that was doing Rails development, and then didn't use Python that much. I've used it for a fair amount of kind of system automation stuff on and off through the years. And I've had a couple of clients that were building apps in Django. And so I've kind of dabbled with Python there, but I certainly wouldn't consider myself an expert.
And before we get too far into the discussion about how to use feature flags and some of the advanced concepts, can you just start by describing a bit about what the idea of a feature flag is and maybe some of your first experience of experiencing them and how it affected your overall approach to software development?
Sure. So I think the way I think about it, kind of fundamentally, a feature flag is a way of choosing between two code paths, normally at runtime. So you can think of it as a way to kind of dynamically choose or adjust the business logic in a system in your kind of app without recompiling and redeploying that app. And we can probably talk a little bit about later on about kind of how dynamic that decision making process is. But I think that's the kind of the fundamentals of what a feature toggle is and or a feature flag is. They tend to have a few different names. Feature toggle is the one I used to use. Feature flag is, I think, the term that's got more acceptance or more commonly used nowadays. I've also seen it called a feature bit, feature flipper. Sometimes people kind of conflate a little bit A/B testing and feature flag. So yeah, the naming's kind of interesting. And I think my first experience with feature flags was years and years ago, working at a startup where we implemented them. I think they were called feature bits at that company, and didn't use them for a few years after that. We used them a little bit, but I didn't really use them that much. And then after I worked at that company, I worked at a consulting company called ThoughtWorks, and we were really big into practices like continuous delivery and trunk-based development. And feature flags kind of played quite heavily into that. And when we use them in that way, they really actually pretty radically kind of changed the way that we were able to build software, mainly because they allowed us to get rid of feature branches or get rid of branching and kind of have just people working directly in a shared in a shared branch in our code repo and still be able to kind of deploy software into production very frequently. So at a lot of teams I was at ThoughtWorks, we'd be deploying to production on a very regular basis, like once a day maybe, which was quite, at the time was kind of quite, definitely felt like a pretty rapid tempo. And we were able to do that without using branches and without kind of having to slow ourselves down with that kind of stuff. And I think feature flags were a big part of how we were able to achieve that.
And you mentioned being able to do trunk-based development because of feature gating in the code level rather than at the branch level, and also mentioned some association with A/B testing. I wonder if you can just discuss some of the broader scope of the ways that feature flags are used and just some of the ways that they'll manifest in somebody's code base.
Yeah, I think feature flagging is really interesting. In my kind of experience over time, what's really interesting to me is like the number of different things that people use feature flags for, or kind of the number of different words that are concepts that kind of get mixed around feature flagging. And I used to get quite annoyed when people referred to something as a feature flag in something that I personally kind of didn't consider to be a feature flag. So an A/B testing, for example, people would sometimes say, "Oh yeah, we're doing feature flagging. We use this A/B testing framework," or we'll add a feature flag to test out that whether the color of this button looks good or not. And I would get kind of grumpy and I would correct people. Like, "Oh, well, technically that's not a feature flag. That's something different." And what I've kind of come to embrace over the time is these are all essentially, they come down to that same fundamental capability of choosing code paths at runtime. And so if you think about like what are the different things you can do with that capability, the way I think about it, there's kind of these four main categories of feature flags. So the one that the main category that I kind of was my, I guess, my gateway drug for feature flagging was what I would call a release flag or a release toggle. And that's a way for an engineer to hide half-finished code from users. So the ability to essentially deploy a half-finished feature into production without releasing that feature to your users because it's protected behind a flag. So I'm trying to think of an example. So if I'm implementing a new login feature where you can log in via kind of a social login to my application, I can kind of protect the button that says, log in via Twitter or MySpace or whatever. I could kind of hide that button behind a feature flag. And that means I can be working on that feature and deploying it into my production environment without expose the code's there that kind of that feature, but I haven't turned it on yet by kind of flipping that flag on, flipping that feature flag on. And so I can kind of work in a shared branch, work and even deploy that stuff out to production without worrying that it's that half-finished work, that latent code is going to be shown to a user. So that's like the kind of the first use case, the release toggle. And then there's another kind of use case around kind of experimentation where I might want to try out an A/B test, for example. So I'm trying to think of an example where let's say I want to see whether a new recommendations engine is more likely to get my users to click on a recommendation. So maybe I'll have the old recommendation system and the new recommendation system kind of both deployed into my my production system, and then I can choose whether to use the new recommendation system or not. And maybe I send 50% of my users to that new recommendation system and 50% to my old recommendation system. So that's kind of like, on the one hand, it feels like a really different use case. At the end of the day, if you think about like what's happening inside of your software, it's the exact same thing. You've got essentially like an if-else statement or something similar to that. And you're at runtime, your code is deciding, should I go down this code path or this other code path? So that's the second use case, is kind of experimentation. Third use case I've seen with people using feature flags for are kind of operational flags. So that's a way to kind of disable parts of your system or dynamically change how your system's operating in production without having to redeploy your software. So if you have, let's say you have two different third parties, or you have a third party that calculates what the shipping costs are going to be for your e-commerce package or your e-commerce software. And this vendor is kind of flaky and sometimes their system goes down, and you want a way to kind of just dynamically just turn off that feature in production. If they're having a bad day, you basically want to just turn it off rather than having it be broken on your site. You could have a feature flag behind that's kind of protecting that feature, and if you see that that third party system is having a tough time, you could just turn it off without kind of having to like redeploy your software or make some kind of urgent change to your system. That's the third thing I see people using, operations toggles. And then there's a fourth thing around kind of permissioning. So basically, depending on what user you are, I'm going to let you do something different. So if you're an admin user, I'm going to show the edit button. But if you're not the admin user, then I'm not going to show the edit button. Or if you're a premium user, then I'm going to show you the free shipping option. And if you're not a premium user, then I'm not going to show you the free shipping option. That's kind of a simplification of probably what you'd want to do. But there's this kind of idea of, based on who you are, I'm going to either turn off or on certain capabilities. And that's one where I think a lot of people would say, well, that's not a feature flag, that's something different. And I kind of used to be one of those people. What I've found over time in talking to different organizations about how they use feature flags is there is kind of a benefit in kind of embracing the fact that even though the kind of scenarios are quite different and the use cases are quite different, the fundamental capability is the same. And there's kind of a benefit in kind of thinking about these as different types of the same thing.
And in my experience, a lot of developers will start to grow into using feature flags for a particular capability that they're building, either because it's going to take too long to actually get the whole thing out into production in one fell swoop, where they don't want to have a long-lived branch that's going to be a pain to merge 3 months down the road, or because they have something that they want to be able to launch into a production or a pre-production environment so that they can test out how it actually functions outside of their local development context, and they want to be able to turn it on and off until they're sure that it's working properly. And then for some of these other scenarios, particularly for A/B testing or operations toggles, where you want this to be more long-lived, the way that you would actually approach implementing the toggling infrastructure is a lot different, where a lot of times you might just have an environment variable or something that lives close to the logic branch that you're dealing with, and then maybe down the road you have another PR that just strips it back out. For these other use cases, you want to have something a bit more sophisticated. And I'm curious, what are some of the ways that you've seen people approach the overall introduction of feature toggles into their code base, and maybe some of the anti-patterns as to how people have used them in your experience?
Yeah, I mean, I think so that thing about like how people introduce it is an interesting one. And I think my experience has been similar to yours, where usually these things initially get introduced into a code base, or the concept of feature flags a lot of times gets added by an engineer that wants to, like you're saying, they want to work on this thing without having to create a big, long feature branch that's going to be a pain to merge. That's one kind of like gateway. The other thing, and it's quite different, the other entry point I see is usually from like a product manager who wants to be able to do some kind of A/B testing. And those are quite different entries into kind of the concept of feature flagging. And so that's kind of interesting because it can change quite a lot, like how you get started. And now I'm forgetting what the second part of your question was, apart from the kind of the entry point part.
Just curious about any sort of anti-patterns that you've seen people use around how they either introduce feature flagging and implement it,
Gotcha.
or how they're actually employing it in their software.
So I think the biggest, there's a few things I see people struggling with. The most common problem I see with people who are using feature flags a lot is managing those feature flags and retiring, keeping the number of active, or the number of flags kind of in check. So as time goes on, you are motivated to add flags because you want to avoid creating a feature branch, or you want to try out a new feature, experiment it against a certain number of users and that kind of thing. So you're motivated to kind of add them, and then there tends to be kind of this kind of tech debt type thing where it's tough to clean them up over time. That's one very common challenge that I see people having is figuring out how to track the flags in their system and how to actually kind of manage them and remove them over time. And kind of related to that is when people use the wrong technique for the wrong type of flag in terms of how they implement that flag. So I'll give you two examples. So if I was doing a release toggle, a release flag, where it's like I'm kind of just temporarily want to hide this thing, So my social login, I want to kind of temporarily hide this thing for a week or so while it's under development, and then once it's done, I'm going to turn it on and I'm going to remove that kind of the if else statement from my code or whatever. If I know that this is a kind of a short-lived flag, then it's actually probably not terrible if I literally implement that with an if else in my code base. But if it's a flag that's going to be used for a long period of time, so like one of those operational flags that's going to be there for a long time, or an admin is admin type thing that's going to be probably in your code base kind of forever, then implementing that with an if else is going to be really painful. That's going to get really painful over time, particularly if you've got a lot of flags over time. So I think when I talk about feature flags and I find people who are skeptical about it, a lot of times they've been burned by a code base where people have just sprinkled if-else statements everywhere. So I think that's like a big anti-pattern. And I think fundamentally part of it is people not thinking about why they're creating this flag and how long that flag is going to live in your code base. So that's part of it is not kind of thinking about how long this thing is going to be there. And then I think the other part is just like teams not having the right kind of processes in place to clean those flags up over time, either to figure out which flags, either just like the management and kind of tracking like which flags are in use, which flags aren't, or more of a process thing of kind of getting the time to kind of keep the code base cleaned up and kind of keeping the campground clean.
Another thing too is that because of the fact that a lot of teams will just introduce flagging ad hoc to begin with, that it then starts to catch on as a good idea of, oh, I can do this and I don't have to maintain this long-running branch.
Yeah.
So another person will implement their own flag, but there isn't really any consensus as to what the common entry point is or what the common design pattern is as to how we maintain these flags. And so somebody will put their flag in for their block of code that they care about. The next person will put it in for the block of code that they care about. And then it can quickly devolve into just everybody putting the flags wherever they feel like, rather than taking a step back to think about, okay, well, now that we're starting to use this, how do we actually design it into a system that is easy to maintain, where we have a common entry point and we can clearly see what flags exist in a code base? Because otherwise you might start to see basically the same type of flag or a very similar flag in two different places, and you don't really know which one does what or for why.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think I describe feature flagging as it's kind of like a little bit of an iceberg, where like when you get started with it, it's very simple, right? You're just like, particularly because normally you get started and it's just literally just one thing you want to toggle, and you're just like, oh well. Sometimes people don't even really realize that what they're creating is a feature flag. They'll say like, oh well, we've already got this configuration system, so we'll add an extra field like use new whatever, and then we'll just check the configuration here in this part of the code base, and if it's on, then we'll use it, and if it's not, we're not. And then kind of like there's this creeping thing over time, like exactly like you're saying, like someone else is like, oh yeah, we could do that config thing that we did, but for this other thing. And then eventually there's like 3 or 4 places where you're using that you're checking the configuration and making a decision on your code. And then someone's like, oh, well, we need to do this per user. So, depending on who the user is. So I guess that we should add this extra thing. And like kind of like over time, there's kind of boiling a frog. You get to this situation 6 months time where it's a mess, and no one ever decided that they wanted it to be a mess, and no one consciously said let's just make this messy. It's just it's slowly, the scope of the thing kind of changed, grew over time. The type of things that people wanted to do with it grows over time, and if you're not careful, you can end up just kind of taking lots of little steps, none of which seem bad, but when you look back at where you are in 6 months, you're like, wow, why, what the heck are we doing here?
And so for teams who are starting to think about feature toggling or already have something in place, what are some of the approaches to implementation that you've seen and that you recommend? And particularly for these different categories that you outlined, do you think it makes sense to have everything route through a single common implementation? Or do the different categories of feature toggles require their own implementation logic?
I think that last part is a really good question. And what I have found is there's a lot of value in kind of decoupling the reason, the place where you're making the decision from the reason that you're making the decision. So kind of decoupling the decision point from the decision logic. So what that means is in the middle of my code, or in the area of the code where I need to make that decision, like should I show recommendation engine A or B? That's really the question I should be asking, right? That code should say, hey, should I show this recommendation system or this other recommendation system, or where should I which class should I use to implement this algorithm, or kind of get the result for this algorithm? That part of your code really shouldn't actually care about feature flags at all. All it knows is like, I know there's two ways I should do this. Tell me which way to do it. And you kind of want to abstract over the reason for the decision. And then kind of the other side of that is somewhere in a centralized place. I think there's a lot of value in centralizing like that, the why for why you're making a decision. And that why could be, we're using this recommendation system because in this context, this is an A/B test, and the user for the current context, like the current request in a web framework, for example, falls into the cohort. So we're going to use recommendation engine A. This other user, the next request comes in, and this user is in a different cohort, so we're going to use the different request recommendation algorithm. So I think that's one thing that I think is really beneficial, is to centralize and abstract the reasons behind the decision being made, and kind of not let that leak into your code. I think that's really valuable. And that's something that if you kind of start with just a simple check a configuration value and call function A or function B, it feels like overkill to do that. But at some point you've got to realize that there's a lot of benefit in kind of abstracting over the reason for the decision versus the place where you're making a decision.
And another thing that complicates the decision as to how specifically to implement the feature flagging is the idea of the overall life cycle of the logic branch, where for something that you're only caring about being able to enable trunk-based development, where everybody can push to one common code branch without having to branch using their source control and just branch by abstraction instead, there's a high probability that once they finish the feature, they're going to want to take out that code branch. And so one suggestion that I've heard before is essentially, as soon as you introduce the feature branch, you introduce another pull request that removes it, but then you don't merge it until you're done with the code that requires it. So that you don't forget about the fact that it's there and that you don't want it to stay there forever. But for some of these operations toggles or A/B testing where it needs to run for a longer period of time, there's a high probability that you're going to maybe want to keep it in the code base, possibly forever. And then the other thing is, if the code that you're writing isn't actually going to be deployed and managed by the same team writing it, and is instead intended as a piece of software that gets deployed into a customer's environment, or if it's an open source project that somebody else is going to use, how you manage documenting the existence of these different feature toggles and what they're used for. And so I'm curious what you have seen as far as beneficial actual implementation strategies and triggering strategies for some of these different types of lifecycle requirements.
Again, like the thing that I've seen that burns people on feature flags is if-else statements sprinkled through your code, and kind of just, it makes it really, really hard to read the code. It makes it really hard to even understand, like, is this part of this code base ever even called? And so my advice in general is, unless you're really confident that this toggle is only going to be in your code base for a very small period of time, and like you're only basically making this decision at one point in the code, then in that situation, maybe just a good old-fashioned if-else is fine. If I should show the social login, then show it, otherwise don't show it. For anything more complicated than that, or for anything that's going to be in your code base for any period of time, then treat this like production code. So use the same good design patterns and kind of software design approaches as you would use for any other kind of thing you're doing in your production code base. So patterns like the strategy pattern, for example, is a kind of a classic way of doing this, where you, rather than saying, I'm going to have 4 if-else statements in different areas of this class, you just have 2 kind of implementations of a common interface. So 2 classes, one that implements recommendation engine A and one that implements recommendation B. And then the consumer of that kind of functionality is just given one of those things, and it doesn't know that it's feature flagged. It doesn't know which way it's going. It's just kind of, you're basically using polymorphism to kind of implement that decision or that dynamism between those two code paths and representing it using polymorphism rather than using sprinkling if else statements everywhere. So I think that's like a really important strategy, and I think it kind of comes down to just embracing that this is just because you're writing it's kind of like it's kind of like unit testing. Just because you're writing a unit test doesn't mean you're allowed to write kind of crappy code. Like you should still write good code. I think the same thing with feature flag. Just because it's a feature flag doesn't mean it's not production code that someone's got to look after and maintain. It doesn't impact your system, so you got to kind of treat it with respect.
Another decision to make, particularly as you get further down the road of using feature flags and they become more of your common development practice and part of your standard operations environment, is the decision as to whether to continue to support a homegrown solution or start looking at third-party libraries or service providers that might have more advanced functionality than what you want to build and maintain on your own. And I'm curious what you have found to be useful considerations when making that build versus buy decision for whether to continue using a homegrown service versus a paid service or a third-party library.
So yeah, I think this kind of goes back to that iceberg thing that I said earlier, where I see a lot of engineering organizations that are using some kind of home rolled feature flagging system. In fact, normally, if there are more than a small size, normally they have 3 or 4 home rolled feature flagging systems. I was actually just talking to a company the other day, and when we started the conversation, I said, "How many of these do you have?" And they said 1. And then I asked a question and they said, well, yeah, I guess now maybe I guess there's 2. And then I said, well, do you ever do this thing? And they're like, oh yeah, I guess we have 3. And I was like, I bet there's someone who's doing this other thing. And they're like, yeah, I guess we probably have 4. So yeah, they kind of, it seems simple to get started, and then the complexity of these things grow over time. And my advice for the kind of the build versus buy thing, I would kind of say build versus buy versus kind of borrow or rent, right? Because you can use a SaaS product, you can use an open source implementation, or you can build your own. Unless it's the core competence, unless it kind of touches on like a core competency of your company, why the hell are you spending time building this thing, right? Like I mean, this is just general advice I give to clients on build versus buy is if it's just a commodity kind of table stakes thing that you need in order to achieve your business goals, then look to buy it, rent it, borrow it. Only if it's going to be a differentiating kind of feature of your product should you be building this stuff yourself. Like you don't have time to mess around implementing your own database. You don't have time to mess around implementing your own UI framework. You actually don't have time to mess around building your own feature flagging system. Like why? Why are you doing that? I'm pretty sure that it'd be cheaper, and definitely cheaper in terms of opportunity cost, to kind of buy one off the shelf or rent it or whatever. So I think I don't think there's that many cases where it makes sense to build your own, unless you are kind of a really large engineering org that has very kind of complex requirements. You need to integrate with some custom internal, I don't know, metric system, or your entire business is built around showing unique things to each user or something like that. I think most of the time, most companies I speak to, they should just be using a SaaS product, or they should be using an open source product.
And one thing that's always a consideration, particularly for production software, is when you are relying on a third-party service, at some point that third-party service ends up impacting your availability based on what their availability patterns are. And so I'm curious if you have seen anything similar happening with some of these SaaS providers for feature toggles, where some sort of system outage on their end might have an unintended consequence on your running application, or do you find that they're generally fairly good at maintaining current state when they're going through an outage and the only thing that is impeded is your ability to actively toggle one of those features that is running in your platform?
Yeah, like so all the SaaS products that I know of have thought about this quite a lot, because it's the kind of thing an engineer thinks of quite a lot when they're trying to decide whether they should use this thing. Is like, well, what will happen if I can't talk to you? And it is, obviously, it's a pretty important question. It's kind of definitely an important thing to think about, because it's essentially if their SLA was directly tied to your entire system not being able to operate, then that's pretty bad. All of the SaaS products I'm aware of have pretty good methodologies to solve this. So they kind of store the state of the flags locally, and you kind of like the systems that they use, the kind of the agents or the library that you're using locally has some kind of ability. It basically fails gracefully when you if it can't phone home. And I think this actually is a really good example of why you should be buying versus building, because I'm pretty sure that the homegrown thing that people build actually sucks more in terms of handling outages. And it turns out that when you're running your own software, you also sometimes have outages. And it turns out that companies who are dedicated to running a feature flagging service are probably going to do a better job of running that feature flagging service than your company that's dedicated to selling pants online. So I hear this kind of, I think it's a really valid thing to ask. And it's a really valid thing to dig into and understand. But normally, I think it's kind of the answer is the flip side to what you'd think. It normally is another reason to be using a hosted product is because you can kind of essentially pay someone else to do the uptime and the monitoring for all of their user base, rather than you having to kind of make sure that your systems are your internal, whatever internal system you're using is going to handle all of these kind of outages and edge cases that could happen.
Another thing to consider when dealing with some sort of dynamic system that can toggle your feature flags or feature branches is the question of auditability, where if it all lives alongside your code base and all you're doing is maybe changing a value in a settings.py file or in a YAML configuration, then you can go back in time and see, okay, this is what the value was at this time, this is what it is now. Whereas if you're just toggling something in a web UI or sending an API request, I'm wondering what you have seen as far as some of the auditability or some of the strategies for auditing those changes over time in that type of context.
Yeah, I think it's a really, really good question. I think, like, in general, if you can make the flagging decision static in terms of, for any request for this version of the code, it's going to go this way through the system or the other way through the system. That's the ideal, because then you get that audit trail via source control, right? So if my decision as to whether to show that social login button is powered entirely by configuration that's kind of maybe hopefully checked into the same repository as my code itself, or maybe there's in a kind of sister repository, then you get this awesome audit trail and audit trail. You also get like nice things around availability because you don't have some external system you need to talk to, et cetera, et cetera. That's great. And I would kind of, there's kind of an argument for doing that for the toggles or the flags that work that way. The problem is almost always there's some need for that flagging configuration to be more dynamic. So for like an operations toggle, for example, the ideal, if you've got a really good continuous delivery practice, and I just talked to a company the other day that does this, if their hair's on fire and they need to turn off the external tax calculation vendor, or maybe switch from recommendation system A to recommendation system B because recommendation system A is eating all of the CPU in the system. If you've got really healthy CD practices, continuous delivery practices, you just update the configuration in code and you run it through your delivery pipeline, and that's how you make that change in production. And if you can do that, then good for you. That's amazing. That's awesome. For most real life organizations, they need like an OSHA capability to do it at runtime without having to make that configuration change. So in that case, you need it to be more dynamic. And if you think about it in terms of things like A/B testing, and if you think about it in terms of toggles that are used to kind of incrementally roll out, let's roll out the social button to 10% of our users and make sure that we don't get any 500s, and then let's roll it out to 50% of our users. Using feature toggles for feature flags for controlled rollout, you generally need it to be more dynamic than a code change. And so in that case, you basically need to get that auditability from there's two ways to get it. One way is to have an audit trail in whatever feature flag kind of management system you're using. So whenever someone updates like what percentage of users should be getting this feature, or whenever someone kind of changes flips the flag dynamically from off to on or vice versa, you record that in some kind of audit log. So that's one thing, and that's great and could well be useful for compliance reasons or whatever. What's probably more useful is observability around your feature flag decisions. So at the point in which, in the context that you're making a flagging decision, so most commonly that would be while serving a web request, you are deciding to do XYZ. If you can include in your logging, in your metrics, in your observability systems, the state of those flags, then you get really, really rich insight, not just an audit trail as to what was happening. This request had a 500, what was happening, but you get the ability to slice and dice and say, we're seeing latencies going up for a certain percentage of requests. Is that related? Is there any correlation between this increase in latency and this feature flag that we flipped on 5 hours ago? That's like a real superpower, particularly if you're using feature flags heavily. The ability to slice and dice your production system metrics, and ideally your business metrics too, right? Like be able to look at a graph that says our conversion rate or the click-through rate on our recommendation system noticeably dropped in the last week. What feature flags did we change around that time? Or even better, is there kind of like a correlation where the people with the feature flag on were behaving differently from the people with the feature flagging off? That's super useful as a general capability. It's something that you need if you're using these for A/B testing, because that's kind of the point, is to say what's the difference in behavior depending on what the state of this flag is. But if you generalize that, and again, I think this is a really good example of why thinking about feature flags broadly, thinking about A/B tests as being in the same conceptual bucket in the same contextual kind of area as a release toggle. If you think about all of those the same way, then you start saying like, well, why can't we do A/B testing for a operational change, or why can't we do A/B testing for every feature? I think like Uber have this kind of phrase saying that like every feature should be an experiment or something like that. So I think kind of what that gets to is, at the end of the day, you should be able to slice and dice any change to the system and say, the people that had this change, how did they behave differently, whether that was more errors or increased latency or lower conversion in terms of people opting to put something into their cart. Like they're all fundamentally the same kind of question that you're asking.
Yeah, and that definitely gets into some of the more advanced use cases, like you were saying, A/B testing and being able to dynamically route traffic through a certain code path based on whether it's a cookie or a header or a user ID. And I'm wondering what you have found to be some of the challenges that organizations or teams face as far as how to implement some of those types of dynamic feature toggles and be able to track the appropriate metrics and getting a useful and effective feedback loop for when those feature toggles are causing problems, or how to measure some of the user-facing metrics or user interactions based on the feature path that they're going down and how that factors back into their overall development workflow.
I mean, I think like the biggest challenge that almost everyone, I haven't really seen people solving this. The biggest challenge is closing that feedback loop between the state of a flag and the kind of the observed behavior, like what actually happened what was the impact of this flag. And I think that what I see a lot is, like loads of places that I talk to, the only way they can correlate, the state of the flag versus the versus the observed behavior is they have there's some kind of proxy way of measuring it. So I was just talking to a company the other day that roll out new features. They had this habit of rolling out new features to a single market first. So their kind of controlled rollout was, let's turn this feature on for Denver, or let's turn this feature on for this specific cohort of users. And then we'll kind of use that as a proxy for what's the impact of that flag. So rather than saying directly, how has this flag affected latency, you look at the things and say, how's the latency for users who are in Denver versus users elsewhere? Or do we have an observably kind of statistically significant change in conversion rate for people in Denver since we rolled out this change? So people do correlation kind of through proxies, and the most obvious one of that is kind of a temporal proxy of like, we know we turned the feature on at 10 p.m. or 12:55 p.m. What was the behavior before 12:55 and after 12:55? So that kind of works ish, and you could do the same thing as by market and say we turned it on in Denver. Did we see anything happen in Denver? That's nice if you don't want to have it just entirely on or entirely off. You want to do a controlled rollout or something where there's a bit of risk, but actually being able to like have a direct correlation between your metrics, and the hardest one is your business metrics, and the state of that feature flag is something that I think almost no companies I've talked to have fully solved. And they've started to solve it, but it's really, really hard. And I think part of what makes it hard is the organizational challenges of the people who are collecting the metrics are not the same people as the people who are kind of building these feature flagging systems, particularly for those kind of marketing and business and product metrics. That's very different from the operations folks who care about latencies, for example.
And then another challenge that we briefly touched on earlier is, how do you handle documenting the complete list of feature toggles that are present in a system and identifying what they're for and what their current state is? The current state being something that you can potentially introspect at runtime, but more generally useful is, what are all the feature toggles that exist, and how do you avoid overloading their intended purpose by just saying, oh, that's close to the code path that I want, I'll just piggyback on that feature flag rather than adding a new one, and just some of the overall strategies of making sure that everybody's aware of what the toggles are, what they're for, and sort of what are the criteria for deciding when to add a new one.
Yeah, I mean, and that's kind of an example of that iceberg thing of, at first it seems like this is a pretty small, straightforward product that an engineer can bang out in on a Friday afternoon, and it'll be a kind of a fun little project. It turns out that there's all these extra capabilities you need. So the real answer for a lot of companies is they have like a spreadsheet, and they track it in a spreadsheet, or they have a wiki page or something like that, which is a really crappy answer. A more mature feature flagging system has a way of adding metadata for each flag. So things like which team owns this flag is super useful, because then you can actually go and ask that person, or the tech lead for that team, or the product manager for that team, like, hey, are you guys still using this? Or are you guys and gals still using this? So being able to attach metadata, I think, is really useful there. Other metadata that's useful is a description, like, what does this flag actually do? It's amazing to me that there are some systems that don't let you actually add like a textual description. It's just like the name. So hopefully, hopefully you're good at one of those hard computer science problems of naming things. Other things that are really useful is, in terms of managing flags, is when was this flag created and when do we expect this flag to be retired? So that goes back to that thing of certain flags you're expecting to only be in your code base for a few weeks, a few days maybe. Certain flags you're expecting to be there for the next 2 years, and being able to ask the system which flags should have expired by now but are still being used is really helpful in terms of kind of keeping hold of that, or keeping in check that kind of that tech debt kind of thing of flags growing over time. So I think those are some really kind of useful ways of kind of extra information of managing those. And a good feature flagging system has that capability. Even if your feature flagging system doesn't have that, even if your home rolled thing or the open source tool you're using or the SaaS tool you're using doesn't have all of those capabilities, the next best thing is to just include that information in source control next to a place where those flags are defined. Normally, this is probably less true in a language like Python, which is kind of more dynamic. But if you're working in a static language, the way these a lot of times the kind of the rubber meets the road with the feature flags is somewhere where you've got like an enumeration or a map or something that kind of lists all the flags in the system or in the code base that this part of the code base is aware of, and lets you kind of say, is this flag on or off? And you can include in source code that extra kind of contextual information, even if it's just in a comment. That's useful. It's there somewhere. And of course, if it's in source code, then you've also got that audit trail of, when it was created, because you can use git log or whatever, and you can even sometimes infer the owner by doing a git blame. So that's the second best thing. I'm not sure if I totally covered all of your question though.
No, I think that was very useful. And another thing that is useful in the idea of when did this toggle get introduced, when is it supposed to go out of use, is the idea of being able to mark a flag as being deprecated, of we don't want to support this anymore. It really needs to go away. Please stop using it.
Yeah. And I feel like there's this, I've talked to teams that have these kind of extreme ideas of like time bombs, right? Where like if the flag is still in use past its expiration date, then like refuse to start the application or something like that. And I was talking to a company the other day about their feature flagging, and they said, yeah, we did that. And inevitably, it just meant that people kept on updating the expiration date to be in the future, which is it's sad, but it's also, I still think there's value in that, because you're at least making it, you're raising awareness of this issue, right? Like it's like the difference between something that's going moldy in the back of the fridge and you can't even see it versus something where you open the fridge and it stinks. Like at least you're getting that smell, and that eventually someone's going to say like, oh gosh, we really got to clean up this mess.
So talking about feature flags, it's very easy to get into the mindset of, oh, feature flags are fabulous. I'm going to use them all over the place. They're wonderful. There's no downside. So what are some of the cases where adding a feature flag is just not worth it because of the additional either cognitive overhead or possibly performance overhead, or just the overall just difficulty of implementing and maintaining feature flags in a code base? I'm curious if you've run into any situations where somebody was using them and you said, that's just a horrible idea. It's much simpler if you just have this one if-else statement.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that teams who have mature users of feature flags who've been using them for a while, one of the things I think very common themes you'll hear is like, we try and keep the number of flags in check. So having literally having a a work in progress limit where you say we're only allowed 5 active flags is legit. And I think teams that are doing that would tell you there's a lot of places where you could put it behind a feature flag, but do we really need to? So if something is, there's an argument to be made for where this is going to be really fiddly to be done with a feature flag, and we're okay with, we are going to go in with our eyes wide open on creating, putting a pause on production deployments for a week for this small system, or making this long-lived feature branch, even though we know it's going to be a horrible merge. I'm pragmatic enough, I think, to say, even though I think in general those are bad practices, there's times when it's good, you know the rules well enough to break them. And I think there are definitely places where you could use a feature flag, but it's better not to. I think there's places where you could use feature flags, but it's better not to. In general, there's definitely a lot of places where you can be smart about where you put that flag. And you can also be smart about other ways to sequence your work so a flag is not necessary. So let's say, for example, our social login feature actually needs like 4 different changes in the system. We've got to add like a new kind of like backend gateway that goes to this authentication system. We've got to add some tables to a database or something. And then we've also got to kind of put that piece of UI in. You only need to put a feature flag behind that last piece of putting the UI in. You can do all that other work without a feature flag. If you're confident that if you're confident that you're going to detect breakage before you put it into prod, or you're kind of, the risk of breakage is not so much that you're kind of worried that you need to be able to instantly turn it back off again. You can make all of the back end kind of behind the scenes changes directly on master if you're doing trunk based development, or via a series of small short-lived feature branches that are checked into master. Make all of those kind of like setting up the setting up the background ahead of time. And then the last thing you do is add that bit of UI that shows that social login button, let's say. And, if you're, a lot of times that last piece doesn't even need to be feature flagged either, because it's like a very small change. You can land that in a single commit or a small short-lived feature branch. And if you don't feel like there's a high risk that you'd want to kind of pull it back straight away. And if you know that you don't need to do any experimentation with this or a controlled rollout where you only roll it out to 5% of your users or whatever else, then don't bother with a feature flag. Just do all the work behind the scenes and then do the last piece that kind of finally surfaces that feature to users at the very end. Then you can avoid using a feature flag. And I think that general technique of and these are sometimes called branch by abstraction techniques. Those general techniques are useful even if you are going to eventually put the entire feature behind a feature flag. Doesn't mean that all the backend pieces have to be checking that feature flag. They can just sit there, and if they're being used, then presumably the feature flag is on. If they're not being used, then the feature flag is off.
And for anybody who wants to dig deeper into feature flags or learn more about it, what are some of the useful pieces of advice or references that you recommend?
So we've already touched on it, but I think the two pieces of advice I have, which sound a bit contradictory, but I don't think they are. The first piece of advice I have is just start really simply. Don't start with a open source framework. Don't start with a SaaS product. If you're literally just want to get started, just start with a simple if-else statement in your code or something like that, and get comfortable with the concept of feature flagging. But as soon as you realize that that this is a useful thing and you want to kind of start using it more broadly, do not kind of take those small series of steps that eventually end up with you hand rolling the 725th half-assed feature flagging system that's inside of a company somewhere. At that point, stop and don't build it yourself. Look at open source libraries, look at SaaS products, and I just don't. So many people build this thing themselves, and I think it's just because they enjoy doing it.
The not invented here problem.
Yeah, or I don't know. It's not even a not invented here thing. It feels like a fun sized problem. It's normally something which is a little bit below the radar of product managers because it starts off as like an engineering internal feature. And so people can kind of sneak it in, but it has enough justification that you don't have to kind of lobby your kind of product manager or your product owner or scrum master or whatever for permission to do it. And so I think honestly, a lot of times it's a fun thing for people to build, and so they end up building themselves, and they kind of should be honest and not do it. And they also just don't realize how much work it's going to be. I worked at a company where the feature flagging system had been built by an intern, and just we were a boiled frog. 6 months later, we're trying to figure out how to get our production systems to be reliable with this code that had its origins in someone's summer project. So it's not a good look. I think the other recommendations I have, which kind of we touched on already, is to prefer static configuration where you can. If you can have a feature flag flipped on or flipped off by a code change, that's great, because you get to leverage all of the quality checks and safety checks that you have in your delivery pipeline when you make that feature flag change, just like as if you'd made a code change. So you flip the flag on, and then you watch and then all the tests pass, the integration tests are ran, and if you've got performance testing, you check that your performance testing hasn't been impacted. That's really nice if you can do that via code change, because you get all that stuff for free, versus if it's a dynamic flag, then essentially you're just like banging something into production without doing any of the tests that you would do for a code change, which is kind of scary in some ways. And then like my last piece of advice is to read up on kind of beyond feature flagging, kind of read up on trunk-based development practices and continuous delivery practices in general. There's a really good website called, I think it's trunkbaseddevelopment.com, which has a lot of good background material. The book, Continuous Delivery, is a little bit old now. It's not, but it's it's a great book. It's got a load of really good stuff about just broadly kind of continuous delivery practices.
Yeah, I'll second that continuous delivery book recommendation yet. The content is a little old and it has some references that might be a little outdated, but the core principles are definitely still completely valid and still
Yeah.
useful to read up on.
Yeah. The only thing that I was just rereading it the other day, or rereading a section of it the other day. And the one thing that's in there that I'd be interested to actually talk to Jez and Dave and see if they still agree with this. The one thing that's in there is kind of it advocates for using release branches as a way to kind of orchestrate releases. And I think that is probably, that advice is now a little out of date because the CI/CD systems that we have today have kind of like delivery pipelines as a first class kind of thing in the system. So some of it is just kind of like, they're talking about SVN and they're not talking about Git because Git wasn't around at the time. But some of it is just like a little bit that, the state of the art has moved on a little bit, but that's like maybe 1% of the content. 99% of the content is just amazingly super valuable, super useful.
Are there any other aspects of feature flagging or your experience of using them or working with companies who have implemented them that we didn't discuss yet that you'd like to cover before we close out the show?
No, I mean, I think we talked about a lot of stuff. I think the main thing that I want people to try and get their heads around is that all these different types of things are kind of fundamentally the same thing, and building it yourself is probably a fun thing to do, but not necessarily the right thing to do.
Always good advice.
Yeah.
All right. I think the only other thing that we didn't really touch on is how feature flags manifest in your tests, but I think anybody who is doing testing can figure that out fairly well, as far as just make sure that you have a test that sets the flag to on and sets it to off and makes sure that both branches have the expected functionality.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we could probably spend another hour talking about this actually, but the other thing that I would say is this is another one of those iceberg things. It is worthwhile adding some kind of awareness of feature flagging into your testing system. So things that I've seen that are really useful is the ability to kind of tag a test as saying this test should be run with the feature flag off and on, and it should behave the same. Or the ability for a test that having your feature flagging system make it easy for a test to temporarily override the state of a flag. And likewise, you talked about this already, but having the ability for a manual tester to temporarily override the state of a flag in order to verify different things. That investment in the feature flagging system, kind of like supporting testability, is definitely a worthwhile thing to do. Sometimes it's not something that is top of mind for engineers if they're not also doing exploratory testing, but it's a really good investment to do that kind of stuff.
Well, for anybody who wants to get in touch with you and follow along with the work that you're up to, I'll have you add your preferred contact information to the show notes. And so with that, I'll move us into the picks. And this week, I'm going to choose the Circuit Playground Express from Adafruit. I started playing around with one a few weeks ago with my kids, and it's been a lot of fun, and been able to use the Circuit Python distribution for experimenting with flashing the LEDs and doing all the fun things you can do on them. So if you're looking for a fun little hardware project that's inexpensive and easy to get started with, I recommend checking those out. And with that, I'll pass it to you, Pete. Do you have any picks this week?
+1 on Adafruit, +1 on all of the Circuit Python stuff is super cool. Also, I'm just a huge fan of Adafruit in general, and they've got a load of just really awesome documentation on there. Like the kind of learning section of their website is amazing, and it's amazing how much stuff they do for free. So yay, I love Adafruit. My recommendation is a book, or my pick is a book called Accelerate, and this is written by Nicole Forsgren, Jez Humble, and Gene Kim. Jez Humble is also one of the co-authors of that continuous delivery book, and they're the people that were behind the DevOps report that has been coming out every year for the last few years. It's amazing because they using actual science to kind of validate what kind of engineering practices work and what don't in terms of like orgs that are making more money. At the end of the day, they actually kind of like look at like which organizations are performing better from kind of like either a kind of a capitalistic perspective, like they make more money than their peers, or from a kind of a social perspective, what are they doing better? And then they back that all the way to what are the engineering practices that correlate, or not even correlate, that drive that kind of success. And they really dig into the details of what that means. So they talk a lot about things like continuous delivery, but also about kind of cultural aspects of the company. And it's super useful it's great advice, and it's advice that I kind of generally, most of the stuff they talk about is stuff that I kind of generally agree with anyway, but it's extra wonderful for it to be stuff I agree with that's actually backed by real science that shows that it's true, rather than it just being like, this is a well-argued case, and so I'm going to kind of hope that they're right about it. So really recommend that book. It's really fun to read as well. And if you're a stats nerd, it has a lot of stuff at the back around how they actually did those stats. So that's one pick. And then the other pick, which is very, very self-serving, is an article that I wrote for Martin Fowler's website, which is just an article about feature toggles. So a lot of stuff we talked about, but some more detail about some of the implementation practices. It's a little bit old now, but I think not that much has changed since I wrote it. So if people want to learn, get into more details about feature toggles, then they should read that. They should read that page. And I think also the last thing I'd say, which isn't a pick, is I really love talking about this stuff, and I really, really love hearing about what people are doing in the real world around feature flagging. So if anyone who's listening to this is kind of got questions or thinks that I'm talking nonsense about one of the points I made, definitely reach out to me, and I'd love to chat more about it.
Yeah, I'll second the article. I actually read through a bunch of that to get ready for this conversation, and I'm definitely going to have to add that Accelerate book to my reading list. So thank you very much for taking the time today to join me and share your experiences of working in this space. It's something that's definitely useful to engineers working in any language. So I appreciate your time, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me on.
Thank you for listening. Don't forget to check out our other show, the Data Engineering Podcast, at dataengineeringpodcast.com for the latest on modern data management. And visit the site at pythonpodcast.com to subscribe to the show, sign up for the mailing list, and read the show notes. And if you've learned something or tried out a project from the show, then tell us about it. Email hosts@podcastinit.com with your story. To help other people find the show, please leave a review on iTunes and tell your friends and coworkers.